as Sophia's laughter rang out across the hotel lobby. I sat only a few steps away, blending in so well you'd never guess I was there. She was completely unaware that I was watching, witnessing her secrets unravel before me like a tangled thread coming undone. Later that day, when she called me, her voice was light and sweet, so casual it could have been mistaken for sincerity. She thought I was at home, blissfully ignorant. But I wasn't. I was right behind them, capturing every damning second. That was the moment my plan for revenge began to take shape. And let me tell you, it wasn't pretty. It was ruthless. Before we dive further into this, let me know where you're tuning in from in the comments. And hey, if you're hooked already, don't forget to hit subscribe and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss what's next. It all started in a quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind of place where the manicured lawns and pristine front porches told only part of the story. Beneath the surface, there were lives weighed down by secrets. Ethan and Sophia lived in one of those seemingly perfect homes, a couple everyone admired. They had it all: success, stability, and a picture-perfect love story that inspired envy. Ethan was the dependable type, a deliberate, loyal man who valued trust above all else. Sophia, his wife of 10 years, was the opposite. She was magnetic and driven, constantly chasing the next big thrill. Ethan had always believed their life together was built on unshakable ground. Despite his flaws, he'd seen himself as redeemed, a man who'd grown wiser over time. But he was only just beginning to understand the fragility of that belief. The cracks in their life together started small. Sophia's late nights became more frequent. The warm, inviting tone in her laughter was replaced by something distant, unfamiliar. Her phone, once casually left on the kitchen counter, was now practically glued to her side. She slipped it into her pocket or held it tightly, even when she moved from room to room. Ethan's gut told him something was wrong. But every time he questioned her, Sophia's reassurances would calm him just enough to make him doubt himself. "Work's been crazy," she'd say with a breezy smile. Yet that smile, a smile that once felt like home, now felt artificial, as if it was covering something up. And then there was Ryan, a name Ethan didn't know yet, but soon enough he'd loathe the sound of it. A stranger who would unravel their world. Whispers of betrayal turned into quiet realizations. But knowing the truth and learning how to live with it, those were two entirely different battles. Ethan was determined to rewrite the narrative before it swallowed him whole. He had always believed that trust was the cornerstone of any strong relationship. But he was learning the hard way that trust is fragile, not destroyed by a single catastrophic event, but by a series of subtle, almost invisible cracks. First, he brushed it off. Sophia had always worked long hours from time to time. It wasn't unusual. Her job was demanding and often kept her at the office well past sunset. But now, the late nights were coming more often, and her explanations grew vaguer. "Team dinner," she'd say offhandedly, shrugging off his concerns. Her once reassuring smile now felt hollow. The changes in her habits were small but undeniable. And that phone always within reach. She'd hold it tight or slip it into her pocket, making sure the screen was never in his line of sight. Sometimes he'd catch the faint sound of her laughter, soft and secretive, as if she thought he wasn't paying attention. Ethan wanted to believe her. He kept telling himself it was all in his head, that work stress was making him paranoid. But the doubts wouldn't stay buried. They lingered in the quiet hours of the night, whispering to him as he lay awake. He watched the soft glow of her phone reflect against her face, while she scrolled through messages she never shared. Ethan began picking up on other subtle but telling signs. The faint scent of expensive perfume clung to her clothes, a fragrance he knew she'd never worn before. There was also the lingering trace of red wine on her breath when she came home, even though she wasn't much of a wine drinker. Her stories about her evenings became more disjointed, her words too polished, like they'd been practiced in front of a mirror. And then came the moment that changed everything. One evening, Ethan got home earlier than usual, eager to surprise Sophia with her favorite takeout. As he set the table, he caught sight of her car pulling into the driveway. From the window, he watched as she remained seated in the driver's seat, her phone pressed to her ear. Her expression was soft, and a private, almost intimate smile curved her lips. It was a look Ethan hadn't seen her wear for him in months. When she finally walked through the door, he greeted her with a casual, "Who were you talking to?" She didn't miss a beat. "Oh, just work stuff," she replied, her voice airy as she slipped into the bedroom without another word. That moment lingered in Ethan's mind like an unshakable ache. The knot in his stomach tightened, and he couldn't ignore the growing dread any longer. His marriage wasn't just strained, it was unraveling. The cracks in their relationship were deepening, and Ethan knew he had to uncover the truth, no matter how much it cost him. Sophia's late nights became a routine, each one accompanied by a flimsy excuse that failed to ease Ethan's mounting suspicions. "Another client meeting," she'd say with a nonchalant shrug as she adjusted her coat by the door. "Just drinks after work. Team bonding," she'd add, brushing past him without a second glance. At first, Ethan forced himself to believe her. He nodded, offering a weak smile, trying to drown out the doubts that clung to him like shadows. But no matter how hard he tried, those shadows followed him, creeping into every quiet corner of their home. The worst part was that it wasn't just the late nights. There were other changes, small but impossible to ignore. Sophia's perfume was different. Something richer, more luxurious, with a floral hint he couldn't place. When he asked her about it, she laughed it off. "A gift from a coworker," she said breezily, waving away his curiosity as if it were unimportant. Then there was her phone. It used to be just another item in the house, left forgotten on the kitchen counter most days. Now it was a constant companion. She clutched it in her hand or kept it tucked away in her pocket, even when she moved from room to room. Ethan noticed how she angled the screen away whenever a message popped up, and how her laughter would cut short the second she noticed him watching. One night, Ethan heard her speaking softly on the phone while she was in the bathroom. The quiet murmur of her voice drifted through the crack in the door. When she finally stepped out, she said it was a work call, but her flushed cheeks and hastily composed expression told a different story. Ethan tried to convince himself he was overthinking it, that his imagination was running wild. But doubt has a way of planting itself and growing, and soon Ethan was spotting red flags everywhere. The way she dressed for her so-called meetings changed too, sleek, fitted dresses he hadn't seen her wear in months. Her stories about her nights out were riddled with inconsistencies. Awkward pauses, hurried corrections, and vague answers that made no sense. But the hardest part wasn't the lies, it was the isolation. Their once easy, flowing conversations had become empty exchanges filled with pleasantries that felt hollow. Ethan felt the distance between them widening with every passing day, and no matter how hard he tried to bridge that gap, Sophia only seemed to pull further away. One evening, as Sophia sat on the couch, chuckling at a text she refused to show him, the weight of it all came crashing down on Ethan. He felt trapped, a stranger in his own marriage, living in a house that no longer felt like home. The suspicion gnawed at him, unraveling what little peace he had left. The woman he had loved for so long was slipping away, and she was taking their life, the life they had built together with her. Deep down, Ethan knew he wasn't imagining it. Something was wrong, and this time he was sure of it. Ethan knew it was only a matter of time before he'd have to face the truth head-on. The breaking point came on an otherwise uneventful Thursday evening. Sophia was in the shower, and her phone rested on the nightstand, its screen lighting up with faint buzzes. Ethan's eyes lingered on it longer than they should have. She'd never been secretive about her phone before, but lately, it seemed like an extension of her hand, always within reach, never out of sight. He told himself it was harmless curiosity as he reached for it, but the icy knot in his stomach told a different story. The lock screen showed nothing incriminating, just the usual flood of social media notifications and work emails. When he tried to open her messages, though, he was met with a surprise. A new passcode. That was new. That was deliberate. But the locked screen didn't stop him from trying again. A few days later, when Sophia briefly left the room, she forgot to lock her phone. Ethan seized the moment, scrolling quickly through her messages. What he found wasn't scandalous. No explicit conversations, no unfamiliar names. But then he noticed something that made his heart sink. Her call logs were empty, completely cleared. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. Clearing call logs wasn't something Sophia had ever done before. It was too deliberate, too careful. He put the phone back exactly where he'd found it, his heart pounding like a drum. He knew he had to dig deeper. A few days later, while sorting through their bills, something unusual caught his eye. A charge for the Mayfair Hotel. It wasn't their anniversary, and they hadn't been there together. The amount, $142.60, jumped out at him, too specific to be overlooked. He sifted through more statements, but nothing else seemed out of place. Still, that one charge was enough to stoke the fire of suspicion burning inside him. That evening, as they sat across from each other at dinner, Ethan decided to bring it up, trying to sound casual. "Hey, I noticed a charge from the Mayfair Hotel last week. Did we go there? Or am I just losing my mind?" Sophia didn't miss a beat. Her expression stayed calm, her voice light. "Oh, that? It was a work thing, a client dinner that ran late. We stayed for drinks afterward, and I must have picked up the tab." Ethan nodded slowly, forcing a smile. But something about her explanation didn't sit right. Her tone was breezy, too breezy, almost rehearsed. She didn't hold his gaze for long, her eyes drifting down to her plate as she shifted her focus back to her food. After that conversation, Ethan couldn't let it go. She'd given him an answer, but it did nothing to quiet the doubts swirling in his mind. The next day, he did something he never thought he'd do. He installed a GPS tracker in her car. He justified it to himself as a way to get the truth he so desperately needed. Every step felt like a betrayal of the man he thought he was. But the ache in his chest, the unbearable weight of not knowing, pushed him forward. Over the next week, he tracked her movements. Most of her trips were ordinary. The office, the grocery store, her yoga class. But on Friday, her routine shifted. Instead of heading to her usual spots, her car stopped downtown, at the Mayfair Hotel. Ethan sat in his car, parked a block away, watching the GPS signal blink on his phone screen. He debated confronting her right then and there. He pictured himself storming into the lobby, demanding answers. But he stayed put, gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. When Sophia came home that evening, she seemed carefree, her mood light, as if the day had been nothing out of the ordinary. Ethan greeted her with a calm voice and a neutral expression. "How was your day?" She smiled effortlessly and mentioned another client meeting, offering no further details. Ethan nodded, keeping his face blank, but inside, he was unraveling. The hotel charge, the empty call logs, her growing secrecy. It all pointed to a reality he wasn't ready to say out loud. But he didn't lash out. He couldn't. Not yet. Instead, he made a decision. He needed more proof. Not for her. For himself. He needed to know once and for all if his fears were justified. If the life they'd built together was real or just an illusion waiting to collapse. The life they had built together, it was starting to feel like it had been built on lies. As Ethan lay in bed that night, Sophia sleeping soundly beside him, he stared up at the ceiling, his mind spinning with plans. Surveillance wasn't just an option anymore. It had become a necessity. The truth was out there, just out of reach, and Ethan was determined to uncover it. No matter the toll it took on his peace, his pride, or his heart. By Saturday afternoon, the crisp autumn air seemed to mirror the chill in his chest. He had waited long enough. The GPS tracker on Sophia's car showed her heading downtown. Not to the mall, not to any of her usual spots, but back to the Mayfair Hotel. The knot in his stomach tightened with every mile as he followed the blinking dot on his phone screen. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white, the blur of the city rushing past as if in slow motion. When he reached the hotel, he parked a block away, his pulse thudding in his ears. From where he sat, he could see her car neatly tucked into a corner of the hotel lot. For a moment, he stayed there, wrestling with the urge to storm inside, demand answers, and let the whole world hear his rage. Instead, he took a deep breath, adjusted his jacket, grabbed his phone, and stepped out into the cool afternoon. The lobby doors slid open with a soft hiss as he entered. The scent of polished wood, expensive cologne, and freshly brewed coffee enveloped him. A low hum of conversation filled the space, accompanied by the soft, melodic strains of piano music playing in the background. Ethan's breath was shallow as his eyes swept the room, and then he saw them. Sophia stood near the elevator, her hand resting lightly on the arm of a man Ethan had never seen before. The man was tall, impeccably dressed, and carried himself with an air of confidence that made Ethan's stomach churn. They were laughing, their heads tilted toward each other as though sharing a secret only they could understand. Ethan froze, his entire world narrowing to that moment. Sophia's face was lit with a warmth and softness he hadn't seen in months. Her laughter, the very sound that had once been his favorite melody, now felt like a slap to the face. Then she reached up and brushed a stray lock of hair from the man's face, her fingers lingering longer than they should have. The first wave was rage, hot, blinding, and consuming. It surged through Ethan, urging him to march across the lobby, rip the man away from her, and shout his pain for everyone to hear. But the rage was quickly followed by devastation, heavier than he had imagined. It settled in his chest like a lead weight, stealing his breath. Steadying himself, Ethan reached for his phone, his hands trembling as he raised it and began snapping photos. Each click of the camera felt like driving a nail straight into his own heart. But he didn't stop. He needed proof, not just for the inevitable confrontation, but for himself to make the truth undeniable. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and Sophia and the man stepped inside. As the doors slid shut, taking them away, Ethan remained rooted to the spot, the faint ding of the elevator echoing in his ears like a cruel reminder. Finally, he turned and walked out into the cool afternoon air. The breeze hit his face like a stinging slap, but it barely registered. Leaning against one of the columns outside, he scrolled through the photos he had taken, each image a brutal confirmation of what his heart had already known. Sophia's betrayal wasn't just a suspicion anymore. It was real. It was undeniable. And now it stared back at him from his phone screen. Then his phone buzzed in his hand, jolting him from his thoughts. The name flashing on the screen made him laugh bitterly. Sophia. He answered, forcing himself to sound normal. "Hey!" she chirped brightly on the other end. "I'm just out shopping with Julie. I'll be home late, so don't wait up." Ethan took a breath, steadying his voice. "Sure. Take your time." As he ended the call, he stared out at the city skyline, his jaw clenched tight. The truth was no longer a question, it was a weapon. And Ethan knew he would use it. But not yet. Not like this. For now he would wait. The weight of his evidence pressed against him like armor. Soon, though, the moment would come when he'd wield it. And when that moment came, there'd be no turning back. The storm inside Ethan grew stronger, fed by every lie that passed Sophia's lips. Her excuses became more elaborate, delivered with a polished ease that made his stomach twist. One evening, she smiled over dinner, her voice light as she said, "I'll be working late tomorrow. I've got an early breakfast meeting around 4. If you want to swing by after work, maybe we could grab a drink." Ethan nodded, keeping his expression calm and his smile measured to perfection. "Sure. Sounds like a plan." He felt like he was laughing through gritted teeth, pretending everything was fine when the truth was eating him alive. Every word out of her mouth felt like a taunt, a cruel test to see how much he could take. But Ethan's calm wasn't indifference. It was strategy. His silence wasn't weakness, it was control. The photos of her with Ryan, saved carefully on his phone, served as his reality check. Each time Sophia lied to his face, he thought of those images and used them to steel himself. She believed he was oblivious, and that false assumption gave him the upper hand. Ethan's plan began to take form, every step rooted in precision. He tracked her routines, noted when she left, where she claimed to be, and how long she stayed away. Each detail was a piece of a larger puzzle he was determined to solve. He started small, gathering subtle clues. The slight hesitation in her voice when she mentioned Ryan in passing. The way her shoulders tensed when he asked innocent questions. Ethan knew that if he let his anger loose too soon, it would ruin his chance for justice. Revenge required patience and a steady hand. One evening, as Sophia giggled at another text she wouldn't share, Ethan smiled back, but his mind was sharp, calculating. The storm within him had changed. It wasn't chaos anymore. It was controlled, focused. He wasn't just a betrayed husband. He was a man preparing for war, determined that when the truth came crashing down, it would be on his terms. And Sophia would never see it coming. Ethan's first moves were subtle, barely noticeable. One evening, while Sophia was at work, he went into her closet. He wasn't looking for more evidence. He was planting seeds of confusion. He took small things she loved, a winter scarf, a bracelet her mother had given her. The next morning, she stood in front of the mirror, frowning. "Have you seen my bracelet?" she asked, brows knitted. Ethan shrugged, his tone neutral. "Maybe you misplaced it." Her puzzled expression was a tiny crack, the first of many. Next, he switched out her expensive perfume with a cheap imitation. The following morning, she wrinkled her nose after spraying it. "Must be a bad batch," she muttered before tossing the bottle aside. Ethan said nothing, savoring the flicker of frustration that crossed her face. But unsettling Sophia wasn't enough. Ryan needed to feel the weight of Ethan's anger too. Ethan composed a carefully crafted anonymous email to Ryan's employer, a small marketing firm. He attached one of the photos he had taken outside the Mayfair Hotel. The subject line read, "Are your employees upholding company values?" The fallout was swift. By the end of the week, whispers in the office turned into open accusations, and Ryan was fired. Sophia came home furious, tossing her bag onto the couch. "Ryan says someone's spreading lies about him," she said, her voice sharp with frustration. Ethan raised an eyebrow, feigning interest. "Weird," he replied, watching her squirm under his gaze. The tension between them grew thicker by the day. Ethan decided to up the stakes. Late one night, he sent a message to Ryan from Sophia's phone. "I think Ethan knows. We need to stop this." After sending it, he deleted the message and waited. The next morning, he watched as Sophia stared at her phone, her face pale as she read Ryan's response. "What do you mean? Did he say something?" Ethan's voice was casual as he sipped his coffee. "Something wrong?" Sophia forced a weak laugh. "No, just something weird," she murmured, but the crack in her composure was obvious. The final blow was public, just as Ethan had planned. He hosted a dinner party at their home, inviting close friends and neighbors. Sophia reluctantly played the part of the perfect hostess, but Ethan noticed the way her hands fidgeted and how her smile faltered. After dinner, he stood up and raised his glass. He smiled warmly, his voice steady and calm. "Thank you all for being here tonight. It's been a rough few months, but I've learned something important. Loyalty and trust are the most important things in life." Ethan's voice was calm, but each word carried the weight of a reckoning. For a brief moment, Sophia's shoulders relaxed, as though she thought the worst had passed. But her relief was fleeting. Ethan picked up the remote and clicked a button, and the TV behind him flickered to life. A slideshow of photos began to play. Images of Sophia and Ryan walking into the Mayfair Hotel, laughing in the lobby, their closeness unmistakable. The room fell into stunned silence. Gasps rippled through the crowd as heads turned toward Sophia. Her face went pale, her confidence draining away in an instant. "Ethan," she hissed, her voice trembling with a mix of panic and fury. "What are you doing?" Ethan didn't so much as glance at her. His gaze stayed on the screen as he continued, his tone steady and unforgiving. "This is a reminder about honesty and relationships. Some lessons need to be learned the hard way." The fallout was immediate. Guests murmured in hushed whispers, their expressions shifting from shock to judgment. Faces that had once greeted Sophia with warmth now held only disdain. Her meticulously built social world was unraveling before her very eyes. The consequences spread like wildfire. By the next morning, whispers about the scandal reached her workplace. An anonymous email, crafted by Ethan, hinted at suspicious expenses and an inappropriate relationship with a coworker. It wasn't long before an internal investigation began. Within days, Sophia was demoted and quietly cast out by her colleagues. who once admired her but now kept their distance. Ryan wasn't spared either. The news of his firing spread quickly through his professional network. Once respected and self-assured, Ryan now found himself shut out of job opportunities, his reputation stained. He became paranoid, convinced someone was deliberately destroying his life, though he had no proof of who it was. His once cozy affair with Sophia soured, replaced by accusations and resentment. Their relationship had become a battleground of blame. Ethan watched it all unfold from the sidelines, his satisfaction cold and measured. This wasn't just about revealing the truth. It was about making sure their betrayal left scars as deep as the ones they'd inflicted on him. Sophia's carefully curated life crumbled piece by piece. After the dinner party, the whispers followed her everywhere. Friends who had once welcomed her with open arms now avoided eye contact when they saw her at the grocery store. Invitations to brunches, book clubs, and social events vanished. Her once glittering social circle had turned its back on her, leaving her with nothing but silence and judgment. At work, things only got worse. Her boss called her into a meeting to address the allegations of falsified expenses. Though she denied everything, the evidence was damning. Her pristine reputation was now irreparably tarnished. By the end of the week, she was reassigned to a low-level role at a remote satellite office, a demotion disguised as a restructuring. She came home that evening pale and trembling, slamming her bag onto the kitchen counter. "They're transferring me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan didn't feign surprise. He shrugged, his tone even. "It happens." He watched her crumble under the weight of her decisions, but he felt no pity. Every consequence was one she had earned. Ryan's fall was equally harsh. His sudden unemployment sent shockwaves through his small industry. The charming, confident man who once seemed untouchable was now desperate, disheveled, and isolated. Bills piled up, his phone stopped ringing, and even the few friends he had left kept their distance, unwilling to associate with his tarnished name. Ethan remained distant, quietly observing as their lives unraveled. He had made sure their betrayals had consequences they could never escape. When the divorce papers were finally served, Sophia didn't even argue. She simply nodded, her eyes hollow, as Ethan explained that he was done. Her choices had led them here, and now she was paying the price. Ethan walked out without a backward glance, determined to leave the wreckage of their lives behind and reclaim his own. The divorce proceedings were swift but thorough. Ethan had come prepared with undeniable evidence. Photos, texts, and financial records showing how she had misused their joint funds for her affair. The judge's decision was clear-cut, and sympathy for Sophia was in short supply. Ethan retained ownership of the house, the majority of their savings, and their key assets. Sophia was left with her car and a modest alimony payment, barely enough to scrape by. Sophia's new life was a shadow of what it had once been. She moved into a cramped, dimly lit apartment on the outskirts of town. The elegant furniture and designer clothes she had once flaunted were gone, replaced by second-hand pieces and worn outfits. She took a job well below her qualifications, her once promising career dimmed by the whispers that followed her wherever she went. Every day seemed heavier for Sophia. The confident woman she had once been was gone, replaced by someone exhausted, burdened by regret. She avoided the places where she had once shined, retreating further into a life she never imagined for herself. The places Sophia once visited with ease now felt unbearable. She avoided them, unwilling to endure the judgmental stares of former friends. Even her own family kept their distance, their disappointment in her hanging in the air like a silent accusation. Ryan's fate was even harsher. After losing his job and his reputation, he disappeared. Friends speculated that he had left the city, unable to face the fallout of his actions. No one knew where he had gone, and worse, no one cared. He had become a ghost, a cautionary tale of betrayal and ruin. Meanwhile, Ethan was rebuilding. The house, once filled with reminders of their life together, was transformed into a reflection of his fresh start. The pain that had gripped him for so long began to ease, replaced by a quiet sense of resolve. The contrast was stark. Sophia and Ryan, reduced to shadows of who they once were, lost in the wreckage they had created. Ethan, scarred but stronger, stepped into a future that was his to shape. But as the dust settled, Ethan found himself sitting alone in the quiet house that had once been a home for two. The rage that had fueled him, the cold satisfaction of his well-executed revenge, had faded. In its place was something harder to define, a hollow emptiness that clung to him like a fog, refusing to lift. At first, he told himself that he had won. Sophia's life was in shambles. Ryan had vanished, and the betrayal that had burned in his chest had been avenged. But the satisfaction was fleeting. Late at night, as the silence wrapped around him, he began to wonder. Had it all been worth it? Revenge had consumed him, dragging him into a darkness he hadn't realized he was capable of. Every calculated step, every blow he had dealt, had come at a cost. In dismantling Sophia's life, had he lost a part of himself? He thought about the man he used to be, the one who believed in loyalty and love above all else. That man felt distant now, buried beneath layers of bitterness and pain. But with the emptiness came a surprising clarity. Ethan realized he didn't want to live in the shadow of what had happened. The betrayal had defined him for too long, and if he held onto it any longer, he'd be trapped forever. Rebuilding his life began slowly. He reached out to his sister, Maggie, the one who had always been there, waiting patiently for him to find his way back. On her back porch, over cold beers and long conversations, Ethan began to unpack the weight he'd been carrying. "You did what you had to," Maggie said one evening, her voice steady. "But don't let them keep taking pieces of you. It's time to let go." Her words stayed with him. Little by little, Ethan started reconnecting with friends he had distanced himself from during his spiral into vengeance. He rediscovered hobbies he had abandoned, spent quiet evenings reading instead of replaying old memories, and found solace in the small, peaceful moments that slowly returned to his life. The anger that had once driven him was gone, replaced by a quiet determination to move forward. Sophia and Ryan were now part of his past, painful, unforgettable, but no longer part of his future. Ethan wasn't just healing. He was rebuilding, piece by piece, the man he wanted to be. And this time, nothing and no one would take that away. It was a rainy Thursday afternoon when his phone rang. The name flashing across the screen made him pause. Sophia. He hadn't heard from her since the divorce was finalized. For a moment, he considered ignoring the call. But something, curiosity, or maybe the ghost of a need for closure, urged him to pick up. "Ethan?" Sophia's voice was fragile, barely more than a whisper. I just need to talk. Can we meet?" Ethan's first instinct was to refuse. He had nothing left to say to her. But against his better judgment, he found himself replying, "Fine, but don't expect sympathy." They met at a downtown coffee shop, neutral ground. When Sophia walked in, Ethan almost didn't recognize her. The woman who once carried herself with flawless confidence now looked worn down by life. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her clothes hung loosely on her frame. She seemed like a ghost of the woman he had known. Her clothes hung loosely on her, as if she'd stopped caring altogether. "Thank you for coming," she began, her hands twisting nervously. "I know I hurt you. I destroyed everything, and I'm so sorry." I stared at her, my expression blank. "Did you really expect me to listen calmly? Or were you hoping I'd break down, give you some kind of absolution?" The words felt sharp in my mouth. I remembered something my friend Arthur once told me, how cycling through painful memories felt like fighting a battle you couldn't win. That's exactly what I'd been doing for months, trying to keep my feelings from showing, trying not to let them control me. "I don't expect forgiveness," Sophia whispered. "But I needed you to know. I regret everything. I was selfish, and I lost the best thing in my life." When she finished, I leaned back, crossing my arms. "Do you know what's funny?" My voice was cold, detached. "You never cared about how your choices affected me. But now that your life is in ruins, you're here. For what? Redemption? Closure?" Sophia flinched but didn't argue. I stood, my tone steady but firm. "You made your choices, Sophia. Now you have to live with them. I don't owe you forgiveness. I don't owe you anything. Without waiting for a response, I walked out, leaving her sitting alone, her tears falling silently into her untouched coffee. That meeting marked the final chapter of my old life. When I got home, something inside me shifted. A sense of clarity, a renewed sense of purpose. I began methodically clearing out every last reminder of her. The clothes she had left behind, the photos she insisted on hanging in the living room, all of it had to go. The house that once felt like a prison became a blank canvas. I repainted the walls, replaced the furniture, and filled the rooms with things that reflected me, not us. It was a slow, deliberate process, but it was therapeutic. Each change symbolized a step forward, a step away from the pain. I also started reaching out to people I had pushed away during those dark months. Maggie, my sister, welcomed me back without hesitation. Her arms open, her presence steady. She offered the kind of unconditional support I hadn't even realized I needed. One night, as we sat on her back porch, sipping beers, I confessed everything. I went too far, didn't I? I asked with a half smile, trying to make it sound like a joke. Maggie shook her head. They deserved it. But now, it's time to move on. Don't let them keep taking pieces of you. Her words stayed with me, echoing long after that conversation. I realized that revenge had only given me fleeting satisfaction. It wasn't the key to healing. True peace could only come from letting go and rebuilding who I was. I started small. I hiked trails I hadn't walked in years. I dusted off old books and finally read them. I reconnected with hobbies I'd abandoned and let myself enjoy simple, quiet moments. Little by little, the emptiness that had replaced my anger began to fill with something else. Hope. One evening, I sat on my newly decorated back porch, watching the horizon as the sky shifted into hues of gold and deep crimson. The air was crisp, and the stillness felt comforting instead of suffocating. For the first time in what felt like forever, I was at peace. The pain and betrayal were still part of my story, but they no longer defined me. The future was uncertain, sure, but it was mine. And that was enough. As I stood there, the last light of the setting sun dipping below the horizon, I felt the weight of the past lift, leaving behind only faint scars from a battle I'd fought hard to win. Revenge had been costly. It had taken parts of me I'd never get back. But as I watched the sky blaze one final time before dusk, I understood something. It had been necessary. A brutal reckoning, yes, but one that had set me free. Not all endings are clean, I murmured, a faint smile forming on my lips. But sometimes, ashes are the best place to start again. And with that, I stepped forward, ready for whatever came next.